The following video series will provide many perspectives through the personal narratives of elders and recognized knowledge holders. These videos will also explore how the dispossession of land from Indigenous peoples took place throughout what is now called Canada. This project is intended for educational use only. In our words. As Indigenous peoples, our ways of knowing are strongly connected to our history, land, animals, and the sky. It is through our history that we will be guided into the future. Our words and our land are the truth.
It means that you're wearing different shoes now, and your life is not the same, like that. Now that's the way it was explained to me by my dad. He said, when you're not wearing your own shoes anymore. I already know, like, I'm not going to sleep because I know, like, the deals that were made, like, Kandan Vasidish. I won't sleep because I'm thinking too much, the deals that were made, between the people and the native people, it's not the right deals. So that's the way my dad explained it. So he said, how can you sleep? He said, when you've been cheated out of everything. Of course, he really put the words in,
There's this contemporary, scholarly narrative that we're all treaty people. It's all based from the wampum belt, and it's spiraled into this thing. And then you have this other narrative that's saying, hold on a minute, we didn't cede and surrender the lands. The treaties are talking about a cede and surrender. Why would our people fight in the War of 1812 for an independent homeland only to cede all of it to the British?
To use our language in order to understand what it really means to write a treaty. A treaty means agu diwin. Agu diwin means whatever you have, you'll always retain that. You'll always have that. You'll have the land, you have the everything. You always have that. But what we give you will be on top of what you have. That's what that means.
The wampum treaties were very sacred because the wampum itself is a little animal that lives in the water. And they say that little animal, it's like a water spirit, and all of its life, all it does is it collects medicine from the water and it stores it on its back. They'd take the shell of that little water spirit and they'd make their agreements with it. So it was very sacred.
It took like a whole day for a woman to make one of these beads. And so there was the thought that our rights and everything that we speak about through these wampums comes from the bottom of the ocean floor right to the sky world. And so those natural laws come from that animal that's crawling across the bottom of the floor.
When they say a belt, it's not a belt like this. It's a belt that you put on your head when you're carrying your load. And so the wampum belt symbolized that belt that went here. And so each nation was carrying the other. And so when the British came here, that was the mindset that they ran into with the indigenous people, that something was very sacred about an agreement.
The dish with one spoon, the responsibility that came with that belt, where everybody that was in that wampum, where we shared all the land and the resources, but we all equally shared with that spoon.
It was a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and other nations as well were involved. And what it talked about was how they're going to live together in peace and harmony, and how they're both going to be able to eat off the same dish using one spoon. So for example, this is my rabbit. And then the Métis will say, this is my rabbit. And then the Ojibwe say, well, it's my rabbit. And then you have everybody saying, this is my rabbit. And they all believe they have a right to that rabbit. Poor rabbit. And so the rights-based agenda that these organizations have are really detrimental to our relationships with each other and our way of life on the land, which is what the dish with one spoon talks about. It's not a rights-based relationship or agenda, but it's a responsibility-based friendship that we have with each other.
It goes back to the beginning of what they refer to as Indian time. Indian time is even before the sun rises. That's true Indian time. And that is where that color purple comes in. Once you've seen a sunrise, you will always experience that. And it also marks the beginning of life. And that's why that purple remains there, and the white represents that purity of how we are as well within spirit. People like to call it a goswonta, but goswonta only translates, it's just something that's laid down, or a belt. But when you hold it up, and the term is called Yoha Deini. Yoha Deini talks about this perfect balanced path there. One side represents the spirit, the other side represents the living. And it is a human law that you remain who you are. Or if you are trying to retrace that step, get to know who you are before you live in somebody else's boat. And that it has different meanings, but either side represents again of that respect and that truth and that righteousness in there again. But the common understanding is that they say it's called a goswonta. But Yoha Deini is the closest that we can to call it the two perfect paths. This is who we are, regardless if you are an Anishinaabe or a Haudenosaunee. But when you present it, that's the way you present it, that they stay over there. But it doesn't mean that we can't hold hands and walk together down this river of life.
We have something called the Doctrine of Discovery. And basically what happened was the religious community, specifically the Pope, gave those that followed the Catholic way of life permission to conquer, to kill, to destroy indigenous peoples and get their lands if they were not Christians, and to declare that land theirs. And so they set off across the oceans, and that's exactly what they did. The very first person to declare our land was the Spanish. Then it was the French. The French came, and of course they declared all of the Great Lakes theirs.
When the British came in and defeated the French, they assumed a sovereignty over this piece of eastern North America. That's how arrogant the British are, right? They just assumed we have sovereignty over this piece of land, over New France, and over the 13 colonies. Jeffrey Amherst, you know, we're hearing about that right now. There's statues to Amherst and Jeffrey Amherst. Yeah, he was a racist. He became the commander-in-chief of British forces after 1760s, 59. And Amherst thought that he captured Quebec, Louisbourg, and Montreal. It broke the back of the French Empire, and he thought he would be hailed as a hero. But then, what happens? Pontiac.
So Pontiac was an incredible warrior. His whole body was covered with tattoos. And he was known to like the French. He did not like the British.
Pontiac attacks Fort Detroit and unleashes his fury on the British forts, and that becomes the yoke around Jeffrey Amherst's neck.
So during the Plains of Abraham, that's when the British defeated the French and were able to claim title over this land, which was Crown land. Of course, the indigenous people weren't having it. They were fighting the British at the time.
William Johnson was smart enough to know that we'll never win a war against the Great Lakes tribes, so we have to appease them in another way. It was William Johnson who helped to orchestrate Jeffrey Amherst's removal back to Britain, because he was a land speculator. William Johnson, he was big time, and he was married into the Six Nations. Talk about a conflict of interest. And he reversed the Amherst policy of no alcohol. We don't hear about that. We don't hear about what that did. Go back to your communities and unleash your chaos against yourselves. Murder yourselves, because we don't care. The whole British concept of being able to gain a foothold in eastern North America would be accomplished if the people can destroy themselves.
So at the time when Sir William Johnson was the authority for the British in dealing with Indians, the native people were getting big barrels of whiskey that was just full of poison, and they were dying from this poisoned whiskey. And it was Sir William Johnson that turned those policies around so that the indigenous people could be traded whiskey for lands and for furs. So they say that we're a nation in that particular document. I don't care. Our lands were claimed by the British and stolen, and that's the founding document. The French and the British fought. It was the British that defeated the French, and then they came up with the Royal Proclamation and said, "This is Crown land. You are a nation. Do not sell your land to the French."
The Royal Proclamation established a line. It was really, the British were concerned about the American colonists. There was nothing happening here, right? Pre-1763, nothing. So they struck a line along the crest of the Appalachians, and they said there couldn't be no settlement west of the Appalachians. It was happening in the 1750s. In the 1740s, that settlement was pushing west. And you had these land companies that would be struck, and they were speculating, and they were doing their own treaties with the Six Nations, and so it was doomed for failure.
So our people had ways of knowing and predicting what was going to happen in the future, and they used the spirit of this land to interpret certain agreements and certain things that were going to take place. And of course, during the Treaty of Niagara, they see a turtle help them, and foreseeing the future of the British and how they're going to be coming across the ocean and through the rivers into the territory. And so that's why our people went to Niagara with an open mind, It was because this turtle seen that they were going to come and that they were never going to stop coming. Sir William Johnson gave Pontiac medals, and actually gave everybody medals at the Treaty of Niagara. Lots of chief got medals. And on the medals, they had fires and piles of wood on there, and also a sun, to represent that the Indigenous people's fire were always going to burn bright, that there was always going to be lots of wood to be put in there, and that for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows, we would never be molested by the British, and that our homelands would always be ours. So as long as the sun shines and the grass grows is a terminology that the British came up with, because they believed that the sun would never set on the British Empire. And so this was part of their theme of world domination. And of course it's coded right into the medals, it's coded right into the Royal Proclamation, and of course later on it's symbolic in every agreement after, until of course they lost their power to democracy.
The proclamation said that wherever we need land for settlement, we will treat with the First Nations that are affected. And so the Royal Proclamation establishes the modern treaty process.
And so the Royal Proclamation was used as an agreement so that the Indians at the time, or so-called Indians, wouldn't sell their land to the French. And was actually a doctrine of discovery proclamation to secure stolen lands. So the Royal Proclamation is, of course, the grandfather document of it's the beginning of the paper trail of how our lands got stolen.
Even though it was doomed, the Royal Proclamation still has that important piece in there about how land has to be taken up, and then where it's not taken up, it remains the Indian hunting ground. So that's the key, right? That's critical.
So Chief Pontiac was not having the Royal Proclamation. He was not having the Treaty of Niagara. He felt that it was important to keep Indigenous lands away from the British. He felt that they were crooked and that they were going to try to steal all of the land. And so it was years after when he actually gave his pipe to Sir William Johnson and said, "I'll fight you no more." But clearly told him, that he knew that what he was up to and he didn't like it, but that he would honor peace if that's what it was. They actually say that the British themselves hired this other tribe to kill him. And so they got rid of Pontiac because he was the rebellion. He was the threat. And God forbid if he was ever to get a second wind. To think that everybody was conglomerated in this big happy family is not the truth. They were still fighting. There's actually still battles that took place along the North Shore after the Treaty of Niagara.
You see this progression of degradation, I guess you will call it, in the relationship. The first survey occurs at Kingston in 1783. The gunshot, there's not even any proof that it was executed by the chiefs. So then if you start to look at that partnership or that relationship from 1764, nothing really happens along the North Shore of Lake Ontario until after the Revolution. There isn't really no treaty relationship. It was just a matter of opening up the land to resettle the Loyalists.
Chief Shenguak was an Ojibwe man who was born
south of Lake Superior, and he was raised by his mother. And he quickly became a very spiritual person and was noted for his strong medicinal abilities, but also his warrior ways. And so they say the Americans started to cross onto the north shore of Lake Huron and Lake Superior, and they started to take resources. And of course, we don't view those things as resources. That's our land. There's a lot of spirits in that. So of course, Shingwak quickly went to defend, their indigenous territories from the Americans. And in July of 1812, Chief Shingwak took 800 warriors to St. Joseph Island. There was a fort there. He gathered up a handful of British, like not even 50 of them, and zoomed across to Fort Mackinac and took over the fort, the American fort. And actually this started the War of 1812. The Ojibwe people were fighting in the War of 1812 to protect their own autonomy. They weren't fighting to protect the British land, because at that time there simply wasn't any. Those were still indigenous lands. And Chief Shingwak said, we are going to war to protect our independent Ojibwe homelands. And so he gathered warriors from all over the place, same with Tecumseh, and they fought, fighting for their own lands. Of course, the British fought the French to claim title. While this was going on, this new entity called America was formed, and they're trying to define their territory, so of course the British had to fight them. And once they did, of course they claimed what we now know as Canada as Crown land. So during this whole treaty process, the populations of indigenous people were very, very low. You had influenza, you had outbreaks of smallpox, and also they say that half of the population around the Great Lakes were diminished during the War of 1812.
The borderlands are sealed after the War of 1812. That sort of severs the Great Western Confederacy, our people and those tribes on the other side of the American border. You have now the British realize that the border is vulnerable. The border has been breached 4 times by the Americans. Shadow Gay, Chrysler's Farm, York, and Detroit. And so the British now need to secure land in from the old treaties. Whoever could build the first mills, those guys were the ones that became the real important people in the growing communities. So then the ecology starts to change. You start to flood the streams and the rivers, and that's going to change the ecology. Colonial drainage laws come down in 1835. So farmers now have the authority or the ability now to drain the land. There's the Union that occurs in 1841, and the province of Canada is created out of that.
The British had everything mapped out. They had all of the copper and the nickel and the white pine. They had all of the gold, all mapped out. And so once the land was secured as Crown land from the Americans, and it eliminated any threat from the Americans, then they went into full-on resource extraction. That was the whole plan from the beginning.
And then the Bagot Commission occurs, and that now takes on the Indian problem. Out of the Bagot Commission comes this idea of the industrial school. And so it's a predecessor of the residential school. T.G. Anderson, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, he comes to the communities and he says to the people, we would like the smaller reserve communities to move to those communities, participate in this industrial school. And so the chiefs agreed that we will provide 1/4 of our annuity money to help support the schools. And they buy into this scheme because they believe that education will help our people survive. Why did they do that? Because our people are still de facto self-governing. It's pre-Confederation, right? Our people control their treaty money, they control their membership, and they control their land and resources. What's left of it?
So the indigenous people fought in the War of 1812 to protect their own autonomy. They weren't fighting to protect the British land, because at that time there simply wasn't any. Those were still indigenous lands. And it didn't take long before they started to resist. And they started to rebel. And of course, again, it was Chief Shingwak and a small band of people that started a rebellion. Chief Shingwak was arrested. He was brought down to Yorktown, what is now Toronto, and he went to court. And he told the judge, "You kick our people like dogs, and these dogs are going to bite back." The Crown at the time said, "We can't charge this man, and we have to let him go, because we don't have agreements with them. We don't have treaties with them." They never surrendered their legal autonomy or jurisdiction over how they govern affairs in their lands. But even at that time, when he was arrested, the people were ready to go to war. It was a very volatile time. So of course the British sent Robinson down to make the treaty and negotiated what Canada calls the cede and surrender of our traditional territory, which is false. Which afterwards he actually bragged to the Crown, stating that he was able to get so much land for only $2,500. The British actually offered the Anishinaabeg, our tribe, a couple of wampum belts. One of them was a Great Covenant Chain wampum belt. And so the idea of that belt was that if one nation was in need, they would roll what was needed down the belt, and it would go to the other person, because the two people are carrying the belt. And what happened was the British, they just kept asking for this, asking for that. They kept taking. And nothing was rolling our way. Everything was rolling their way. And because the British kept taking and taking and taking and not giving anything back, it forced a revolt. And it forced what we know now as the Robinson-Huron Treaty. There was over 20 chiefs that signed, and there was some British officials. But what's funny is that years later we found out that the British that actually signed the treaty, that negotiated the treaty, were actually bragging to the Crown after about how much they got for so little. And so the written document that states a land surrender to the Crown and her heirs forever, and it gives mining special privileges. And so the written document is an absolute lie. Our oral history and our songs state that the treaty was something different. And so I have to question the very foundation of treaty right now as we know it. What they agreed to was that the British were allowed to live in indigenous territories for a little bit, and were allowed to dig the depth of a plow to feed themselves for gardens. And that it wasn't a permanent agreement, that it was a conditional agreement, and that the waters were never to be surrendered, or the land, and that the British were to be given free passage on that land. That's what I was told. So this is what I'd like to see done with the Robinson-Huron Treaty, because it was one of the largest land thefts in Canadian history. And our people really fought hard, and they died so that our people could have healthy land and animals to eat. Right now, under the current idea of treaty, everything is being polluted and destroyed. It's done. It's over. We need new agreements. We need something that's more realistic.
So after the Robinson, Huron, and Superior treaties took place, of course the government just kept rolling on down the line. And they just named them Treaty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so on. And so the numbered treaties fell shortly after the Great Lakes treaties. And by then, they had everything down packed.
Treaty 1 was done August 3rd, 1871. It was signed nation to nation. The treaty was with the Anishinaabe and the Queen. And when they say that treaties are legally binding, they're not talking about Canadian law. They're talking about consultation and consent. That's what makes the treaties legally binding. When the treaties were signed, the clan mothers were satisfied with the three main articles of treaty: health, education, and shelter. They were okay with the idea that the Queen was going to pay for those things. And what happened there was, when they were satisfied with the content of the treaty, they instructed the leaders to sign off on that document.
So what people, I think, need to know is that the numbered treaties are very different than the Superior Robinson treaties. And the Superior Huron treaties, there's absolutely no talk about healthcare, there's no talk about lodging, and there's no talk about education. And they didn't need those things from the British. But because of the smallpox and the eradication of the buffalo on the plains, thousands and thousands of Indigenous people were starving to death. And of course, it was the British, the Crown, that took advantage of that situation and implemented those three things, which is now the basis of the Indian Act.
The Queen's representative said, when they had that article of treaty article, they said, well, I'll take this to Ottawa. The commissioner said, I'll take this to Ottawa. And then when I come back, we'll enforce the treaties. And that never happened. Instead, 5 years later, they legislated the Indian Act.
So the plan of the industrial school has failed by 1861. In 12 years, it's failed. And so the plan shuts down, but the school, of course, stays there. Physically, it stays there. And then they just go on the provincial plan, whatever it was at the time. And then 1867, Confederation. Johnny MacDonald writes the majority of the British North America Act includes Section 9124. And then that gives the Dominion of Canada federal authority to now control our people, as been said, from cradle to grave, and it gives them the legislative authority to then enact the Indian Act.
In 1876, that was a direct assault on the clan system. This is the system that was created for our extermination. This was not a brand new plan in 1876, if my research is right. The Gradual Civilization Act, which later became the Indian Act, began in 1857. So this is a 20-year plan on how to break down this system.
You see, chiefs and councils came in 1876. Articles of treaty happened in 1871. Who signed the treaties? The clan leaders signed the treaties. It wasn't chiefs and councils. And that's where the Grand Chief and various organizations, the AFN, AFC, SCO, they fall under the system here. They fall under the Indian Act. Indian Act chiefs and councils.
In some communities, this was legally enforced. They held elections at gunpoint. And you had to be Christian to participate in those elections. Mm-hmm. And that's how the chief and council system came to be. That was a direct act of violence on our systems of governing. And then now what's happening today, this is no longer seen as legitimate, and chief and councils are misunderstood as our leadership.
See, over here, we don't call them chiefs over here. Chiefs is a derogatory term. And we don't call them chiefs, we call them Kaniganizyad. The ones that lead, Kaniganizyad.
When you call for a chief, you're actually think that you're calling some kind of a municipal representative or a provincial representative or a territorial representative. No, you're actually calling an administrator of a policy of government. No, these are not accidents. This was complete and total political strategy to tear down every single institution of the indigenous people that existed here.
See, when you buy land under the process, under treaty land entitlement, when you buy land, what you're saying is the Queen owns that land. That's what you're saying. And the Queen doesn't own that land. We own it. We own all the land. What they're doing is they never honored the treaties. So what they're doing is they're living here for free. They're living here for free. That's what they're doing. The Queen said that we'll hold this land in trust for you. So why would we let her hold that land in trust for us? That land is ours. The parks and the forest and all of that is ours yet. They can't hold it in trust. Why are we allowing her to hold us in trust?
The reserve system wasn't supposed to last. It was an experiment. It was a school of civilization. We'll get them civilized and turn them into farmers, and then we can get rid of the Indian Reserve, because then we've created the enfranchisement policies, and enfranchisement will now allow us to remove the reserve off the political map.
How we seen the reserve boundary was very simple, was that was a place where the indigenous people could stay, and that was going to be used for them, and that the settlers were not allowed to live on there. But that didn't mean that we were to be contained on there. It didn't mean that they couldn't live off the reserve. So the treaty was to protect their right to live off the reserve, with special protections for the reserve. But in actuality, the Crown turned it around and used the reserve as a place to colonize, and they started to remove the people off the lands so that there could be a free-for-all in resource extraction.
These were all acts of colonialism. And the only problem now is that this policy coupled with residential school and like social engineering, all of that, the only problem is we're still existing through all these different, whether it was legislated genocide or it was all out physical genocide, or, what do they call residential school? Cultural genocide. We were not supposed to be existing. We were supposed to be gone by now.
In the 1860s, our people started to complain about unsurrendered land in Ontario, and in the northern hunting grounds. So they start to complain, and it takes 63 years for the government to validate the claim, and out of that becomes a Williams Commission that is struck in 1923. If you look at the Williams treaties, they included the former gunshot treaty lands, and they also included the townships that flow south of Lake Simcoe and meet gunshot, and they included those lands in as clause 2 of the treaty. And then they also wrote in the basket clause, and the basket clause basically says that if you have any claims before, now, or after, they're all null and void. Don't come back to us after this treaty signed, the basket clause. They've completely contravened what the Royal Proclamation said, because there's already people living in the north. There's already lumbering happening in the northern hunting grounds. There's already mining permits being given out. And there's already settlement that's occurred, so they've completely contravened what the Royal Proclamation said. They're having to correct themselves and take a surrender, but out of that surrender, they take our right to hunt, fish, and trap. They stole the people's right to live off of country food. And the basket clause is just one aspect out of the Williams treaties that was hung around the people's neck. So this is a really critical piece. When you read the treaty, that's the piece that stands out to me, is that the government said that the Indian title was the right to hunt, fish, and trap. In the numbered treaties, it's not, because the First Nations retain their right to hunt, fish, and trap over the land that they've surrendered. So there's two different definitions of Indian title between 1871 and 1923. How can that be? How can there be two different definitions of what Indian title is?
I think it means that you're wearing different shoes now, and your life is not the same, like that. Now that's the way it was explained to me by my dad. He said, when you're not wearing your own shoes anymore. I already know that I'm not going to sleep because I know, like the deals that were made, Kandan Basidish. I won't sleep because I'm thinking too much, the deals that were made, between the people and the native people, it's not the right deals. So that's the way my dad explained it. So he said, how can you sleep? He said, when you've been cheated out of everything. Of course, he really put the words in,
We never surrendered no land, and if you go to war with another nation and you lose and you don't surrender your land, and you don't even, not even then, because look at Japan when they did that Hiroshima bomb. They surrendered, but Japan is still Japan. They're independent. Where we should be right now is in a clan system, and that's our own system of government, our governance. We used to be in the hereditary system, but that system became an ego-based system. This is who we are. This is the system what we're supposed to be under here, not the elective system.
So the Crown, when they went into treaty with the Anishinaabe, they were actually a nation of people. And they had a land base, they had a government. The Crown dissolved because of democracy. I mean, England actually became a democratic population of people. The Crown is simply not a nation anymore. It's actually a royal family that owns land in certain parts of the world, but they have no actual power to honor these treaties. And so nation to nation with who? We've been banging our heads on an empty castle now for 100 years. We have land issues, huge land discrepancy issues that have to be made with. That has to be included. This discussion has to be included. Because the whole idea or notion that we have no land doesn't sit well with me. Because our people are starving and we have no economic base, we have no land.
New Canadians come in need to know the true history. They did not know that there is a piece of legislation that is there. It documents that these savages are a problem and we need to get rid of them. I'm mad. I never show that anger towards my own people, but we need to prosper somehow. And it goes back to the lineage people that were there, not the hereditary chiefs, but the people that were there. What bloodlines are still contained today? They have to come forward and say, okay, on behalf of my seventh grandfather, we're here to renegotiate what these truly mean. Because none of them are being honored. And what's being affected is the whole entire environment is crumbling.
Here's the problem that we're running into now, is that Canada inherited these colored titles that they call treaties. They use them for a free-for-all in resource extraction, which is causing abrupt, irreversible climate change. And so I believe that it's time to move away from those agreements and to start working with real people on real issues that are very tangible in terms of how can we help the ecosystems. And the hope lies in regular people. It doesn't rely on these ideations of treaty with the crown. The sun set on the crown on the British Empire a long time ago. Actually, I think we should make agreements with the buffalo or the fish, because this human-to-human stuff is not working out, and it's not doing the natural world any favors.
There's quotes that come down through history that where the government agreed these are a free and independent people. So in that is where the inherent rights lie. That we need the next generations to really start to pull the layers up, keep pulling the layers off, so that they can do what I'm doing, and so that they can hold the government to account. Because if you don't know your history, how do you sit across the table from Director General or whoever? How do you sit across the table and defend your cause or defend your community's history? How do you do that if you don't know the history? It's important.
Educate yourself about the truth. Find out the history of that land. Educate yourself. Become aware of that history of that land. To share that with the new students, to share that with your teachers, share that with your principals, share that out. Help us spread the truth about the land. Build a relationship with your local First Nation and community members.
We have to think about the history of our people and what they've been through and where we're at currently. We're so hard on our people, our own people, with each other, But it's like we have the residential school system, we have the Indian Act, there's a generation that's there that there's been a disconnect because the transfer of knowledge didn't happen because there was a generation that was taken away. And so that's where, the impacts of, that's what we're living today. That's what we're living today. And it's like, okay, this generation that's, running our reserve, they can't connect because that spirit is not there. Because the hereditary chiefs, they're gone now. There's some people that don't even know that they're from those lines, that they are hereditary chiefs. The responsibilities from our clan systems. People don't know their clans. They don't know their names. They don't know that we came here with these gifts that the Creator gave us. It's still there. It's still in our communities. There's still language speakers. It's a small speck in the whole aspect of things, but it's still there. That's the thing. So if we can just, ignite that and empower our people to believe in our own ways, then I believe that we can, stand our people back up again, to believe in our ways.
Treaty means a good even. A good even means whatever you have, you'll always retain that. You'll always have that. You'll have the land, you'll have the everything. You all always have that. But what we give you will be on top of what you have. A good even. That's what that means. Doesn't mean a right. It means a good even. That's what that means.